The American Civil War was a deep and painful chapter in our nation's story. It began in 1861, but its roots ran much deeper, tangled in the complex issue of slavery. The country was split in two. The northern states, the Union, wanted to preserve the United States as one nation. The southern states, the Confederacy, seceded to form their own country, largely to protect their economy and way of life, which was built upon the institution of slavery. For 2 long years, the armies battled across the land, from the fields of Virginia to the banks of the Mississippi River, leaving a trail of sorrow and loss in their wake. Brother fought against brother in a conflict that would ultimately define what America was and what it was to become. In the summer of 1863, the Confederate general, Robert E. Lee, decided to take a great gamble. He led his Army of Northern Virginia out of the war-torn lands of the South and marched them north into Pennsylvania. Lee was a brilliant commander, and he hoped for a decisive victory on Union soil. Such a victory, he believed, could dishearten the North, possibly forcing President Abraham Lincoln to sue for peace. His army was confident, having won significant battles before. They marched with a sense of purpose, believing they could bring the war to a swift and victorious conclusion, far from their own homes and farms. The Union Army, known as the Army of the Potomac, was commanded by a new leader, General George G. Meade. He had only been in command for a few days when he learned of Lee's invasion. His mission was simple but incredibly difficult: find Lee's army and stop it. He had to protect the major cities of the North like Philadelphia and Washington, D.C. The two great armies moved like storm clouds gathering on the horizon, destined to collide. No one planned for the battle to happen in the small, quiet Pennsylvania town of Gettysburg. It was a place of rolling hills, ridges, and farm fields, an unlikely stage for what would become the largest and bloodiest battle ever fought in North America. The encounter began almost by accident. On the morning of July 1, 1863, a Confederate brigade searching for supplies, particularly shoes, stumbled upon Union cavalry just west of Gettysburg. What started as a small skirmish quickly grew as more and more soldiers from both sides were pulled into the fight. The sound of gunfire echoed through the valleys, signaling the start of a monumental struggle. The fate of the town, and perhaps the nation itself, hung in the balance as the first day of battle unfolded, drawing thousands of men into a conflict that neither side had truly intended to begin in that specific place, on that specific day. On that first day, the battle raged west and north of the town. Confederate forces arriving in greater numbers began to push the Union soldiers back. The Union's 1st and 11th Corps fought desperately, but they were overwhelmed. They retreated in disarray through the streets of Gettysburg, seeking refuge on the high ground to the south of the town. The hills there, named Cemetery Hill and Culp's Hill, offered a strong defensive position. It was a critical moment. General Lee saw the opportunity to crush the Union forces before they could fully assemble. But his orders to his subordinate, General Richard Ewell, to take the hills if practicable, were not carried out with the necessary force, a decision that would prove costly. The second day, July 2nd, saw the fighting intensify as both armies were now nearly at full strength. Lee planned to attack the Union flanks, the left and right ends of their line. The Union army had formed a strong defensive position resembling a fishhook, stretching from Culp's Hill to Cemetery Ridge and down to 2 rocky hills known as Little Round Top and Big Round Top. The fighting was ferocious and took place in now famous locations like the Peach Orchard, the Wheat Field, and a jumble of massive boulders called Devil's Den. Men from Maine and Alabama, from New York and Texas, fought and died in these places, turning quiet farmlands into landscapes of unimaginable horror and bravery. One of the most heroic moments of the second day occurred on Little Round Top, the extreme left of the Union line. The hill was initially left undefended, a terrible oversight. A Union general, Gouverneur K. Warren, spotted the danger and rushed troops to the summit just as Confederate soldiers were beginning their assault. Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain and his 20th Maine Regiment were ordered to hold the position at all costs. After repelling several determined attacks, they ran out of ammunition. In a moment of sheer desperation and courage, Chamberlain ordered his men to fix bayonets and charge down the hill, a shocking and successful maneuver that saved the Union flank. By the end of the second day, the Union lines had bent, but they had not broken. The Confederates had gained some ground, including at Culp's Hill, but they had failed to dislodge Meade's army from its strong defensive positions on the high ground. The cost was immense for both sides. The fields were littered with the fallen, and the air was thick with the smoke of battle and the cries of the wounded. As darkness fell over the battlefield, the generals planned their next moves. Lee remained convinced that one more powerful push could shatter the Union army, while Meade, resolute and steady, prepared his men to receive whatever attack the next day would bring. The third and final day of the battle, July 3rd, would be the day of decision. After the attacks on the flanks had failed, General Lee devised a new, audacious plan. He believed that General Meade must have weakened the center of his line to reinforce the flanks on the previous day. Therefore, Lee decided to launch a massive frontal assault directly at the Union center on Cemetery Ridge. He gathered a force of around 12,500 Confederate soldiers for this grand charge. The attack would be led by divisions under General George Pickett, General J. Johnston Pettigrew, and General Isaac R. Trimble. It was an enormous gamble, a final desperate roll of the dice. Before the infantry assault, Lee ordered a massive artillery bombardment to soften up the Union defenses. For nearly 2 hours, around 150 Confederate cannons fired on the Union position on Cemetery Ridge. It was the largest artillery duel of the war. The Union guns returned fire, and the valley between the two armies filled with thunderous noise, smoke, and deadly iron. The bombardment was meant to destroy the Union cannons and demoralize the infantry, but much of the Confederate fire overshot its target, landing behind the front lines. The Union artillery chief cleverly ceased firing for a time, tricking the Confederates into believing their cannons had been silenced. Around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the Confederate cannons fell silent. Then, from the woods of Seminary Ridge, the columns of infantry emerged. They marched in perfect formation, a mile wide, across the open fields toward the Union line, nearly a mile away. It was a magnificent and terrifying sight. The Union soldiers waiting behind a low stone wall on Cemetery Ridge watched them come, holding their fire. As the Confederates crossed the Emmitsburg Road, the Union artillery, which had not been destroyed, opened up with devastating effect, tearing huge gaps in the advancing lines. Still, the Confederates pressed onward, closing ranks and continuing their determined march into a storm of lead. The charge reached its climax at a small clump of trees and an angle in the stone wall, a point that would forever be known as the high-water mark of the Confederacy. A small number of Confederate soldiers, led by General Lewis Armistead, managed to breach the Union line, but they were quickly surrounded and either killed or captured. The attack faltered and then failed completely. The survivors streamed back across the field, a shattered remnant of the proud force that had marched out less than an hour before. Pickett's charge was a catastrophe. Lee rode out to meet his broken men, taking full responsibility, saying, "It is all my fault, the battle was over." The day after the failed charge, on July 4th, Independence Day, a heavy rain fell on Gettysburg, washing over the grim landscape of death and suffering. The two armies stared at each other from across the blood-soaked fields, both exhausted. Lee's army had suffered a crushing defeat and massive casualties from which it would never fully recover. He had no choice but to begin the long, painful retreat back to Virginia. General Meade's army was also badly hurt and did not immediately pursue Lee's retreating forces, a decision for which he was later criticized, but his primary goal of repelling the invasion had been achieved. The threat to the north was over. The Battle of Gettysburg was the turning point of the American Civil War. Combined with the Union victory at Vicksburg on the Mississippi River, which happened on the very same day, July 4, 1863, the tide of the war turned decisively in favor of the Union. The Confederacy had lost too many men and too much momentum. Never again would Lee be able to launch a major offensive into the north. From that point forward, the war would be a slow, grinding conflict, but the ultimate outcome was no longer in doubt. The victory at Gettysburg gave the Union a renewed sense of hope and a clear path toward preserving the nation. A few months later, in November 1863, a national cemetery was dedicated at Gettysburg to honor the thousands of Union soldiers who had died there. President Abraham Lincoln was invited to give a few appropriate remarks. In his brief but powerful speech, the Gettysburg Address, Lincoln redefined the purpose of the war. He spoke not just of preserving the Union, but of a new birth of freedom, connecting the sacrifice of the soldiers to the nation's founding principle that all men are created equal. He challenged the living to ensure that the dead had not died in vain, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. The Battle of Gettysburg remains a sacred event in American history. The battlefield itself is a powerful reminder of the incredible cost of the Civil War and the price of freedom. It stands as a testament to the courage of the soldiers on both sides and to the profound questions about freedom, equality, and nationhood that they fought to answer. The echoes of those 3 days in July still resonate, teaching us about the fragility of our Union and the importance of the ideals for which so many gave what Lincoln called the last full measure of devotion. It is a story that belongs to all of us, a fundamental part of who we are as a people.